Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome all of you to the lecture by Ander and Jenny French of French 2D. After the lecture today, there will be a question and answer session with all the attendees by drawing the questions submitted via the Zoom Q&A function during the talk. I would like to start my introduction to Ander and Jenny with a quote by Adolf Loos, who said, "The house has to please everyone to distinguish it from art that does not have to please anyone. Art is a private matter for the artist, not so with the house. The work of art is set forth in the world without any necessity for its being used for anything. The house serves a purpose. The artwork is not answerable to anyone, the house to everyone. The work of art wants to tear men from their comfort. The house has to serve the comfort. The artwork is revolutionary. The house is conservative. Has the house nothing to do with art and its architecture not one of the arts? That is the truth," end quote. I think what Loos was describing was this dynamic state of in-between, whether pertaining to necessity, accountability, accommodation, or temperament. But rather than forcing one or advocating one to choose one side over the other, he said, that is the truth, advocating architects to embrace this tension of this state of in-between. And this state of in-between is the place where Ander and Jenny thrive in, between practice and academia, between 2 and 3 dimensions, and between conventional project types. I think in many ways, being in between strategically helps Ander and Jenny to evade a shorthanded classification. If we look at French 2D's body of work, it's not that easy to define. I think the work is quite intelligently elusive. There's something hidden about it. At the same time, there's always something a little edgy. There's something a little bit dangerous about the work that makes it exciting and interesting. But it was hard to say exactly what it is about. Because of that, I think others could project their own narratives and fantasies onto it. One of the tenets of their work is this notion of strangeness. In many publications and interviews, they have shared about their predilection for a quote-unquote light strangeness, or describing a work as a strange cartoon icon, or quoted saying that we want to create consensus that you're looking at a familiar object, but then twist the form so that it makes you look again. I think one is reminded of Bertolt Brecht's Verfremdungs or alienation effect in the theater, or Edgar Allan Poe's quote where he said, "There's no exquisite beauty without some strangeness in the proportion." In the same way, I think French 2D's work combines the familiar with the new. They work on housing and mixed-use projects with a focus on strange housing types that combine familiar ideas of home with radical organizations and typologies found in their cohousing and micro-housing projects. On one hand, the work comes across as a striving to be spectacularly and spectacular. On the other hand, the work elicits a certain shock of the new that often takes time to comprehend and get used to. But once your eyes and mind have adjusted to both the familiarity and the newness, they become more beautiful and intelligent as time unfolds. I think another tenet of the practice is the city of Boston. This is the city where they were born and raised and where their practice is based. Ander and Jenny came from a family of architects. Their parents went to Penn, Ander went to Princeton, Jenny to GSD. They pretty much covered the entire East Coast. Their intimate knowledge of the city allows the practice to be both deeply engaged and work critically with local issues of housing, public space, history, and identity. But I'm not saying that they are local architects in a narrow geographical sense. Their practice is part of a larger global discourse in hybrid models that exist between practice and academia, where Ander and Jenny's interest has been the catalyst for their practice-based research and advocacy. Jenny is an assistant professor in practice at Harvard GSD. Ander serves on the board of directors of the Boston Society of Architects, where the pair organized the series Exploring Emerging Modes of Practice titled Now Practice Now. And besides housing, they also work on civic installations and exhibitions that call upon the domestic to bring people together, found in their serial dinner parties, fussy bartering environments, and outscale dresses. French 2D received the 2020 PA Award from Architect Magazine and was named Architectural Records Design Vanguard in 2019. The firm has been featured in magazines such as Domus, Metropolis, Architect's Newspaper, and the Architect Magazine's Nick's Progressives. They were finalists in the MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program and exhibited at the US Pavilion of the 13th Venice Architectural Biennale. In today's lecture, Ander and Jenny raised the question that in a time of physical separation, how can we reflect on a design practice whose focus is collectivity? They would present the recent experiments in architecture, participatory design, and objects, From co-housing and compact living to tableware and dinner parties, they will share new models to encourage thinking and seeing collectively. With an eye to the not distant future, they will discuss ways that interventions within our environment can bring us together again. So welcome, Anda and Jenny. Please take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for your really thoughtful introduction and your read of us. I think your readings of practices and firms are incredibly insightful and actually help us see ourselves. Thank you also to Paige Johnston and Matt Smith and the Communications Office. So, hello, I am Jenny French. Our practice is called French 2D. As Mark mentioned, I'm an assistant professor in the practice of architecture here at the GSD and teach in the core architecture studio sequence.
And I'm Anda French, hi. So it's interesting, we call our firm a sort of small collective, and we often describe our practice as a close practice, which makes it sort of interesting to test out the model of not physically being close right now as we're talking to you. I'm just going to share my screen.
And really, as we've moved to working together remotely, though we're still close, just a few blocks away from each other right now, actually, we realize that it's actually not entirely unfamiliar for us to work together through a flat interface, as actually this is how we already see. We both have the same eye condition that impairs our depth perception. So like this photo, we really only see out of one eye.
And since it's sort of, we sort of work this way anyway, we rely on the doubling of our eye problem as just enough distance between the two of us and our sort of between our right eyes to construct our architectural and intellectual project. Partly because of the hybrid process that we've invented to work together, we're very interested in working through multiple perspectives in architectural design and exploring collectivity.
And this question of collectivity, I think now more than ever, right, is sort of being called for, but perhaps it's being misunderstood at the same time. So we think we have this unique position as two sisters running an architecture practice, and that we really do understand ourselves as a kind of proto-institution, right, a small version of working and seeing and making collectively. And that actually helps us think about how we can scale up that seeing collectively into objects, buildings, and the city. But we have to admit that with our own eye impairment and just in a kind of broader sense, seeing together is not smooth like the stereoscope. Right? Our explorations at French 2D rely on our ability to reconstruct and find vision in something that's impossible for us to perceive with our stereo-blind eyes. So instead,
collective vision for us is the accumulation of multiple viewpoints. We really like Auguste Furman's Kaiser panorama of 1890 because it engages not just with a single viewer, but encourages multiple points of believability and consensus. As Mark mentioned, we do talk about consensus a lot. It's important to us, but we want to make sure that it's understood that consensus does not mean that you have to see something the same way. Two people can look at the same object, but they don't have to see the same thing to agree that the object has value.
And we talk about consensus, collectivity, time, and form. And particularly in our current global situation, we find resonance with work outside and sometimes within the discipline. And we're going to use that today just as a brief way to frame some of the projects we're going to talk about. So this is an image taken from the artist Lucy Raven's moving image piece entitled Curtains. And basically it's a video installation that shows the breaking point of the anaglyph or the construction of a 3D image. Right, so this image is reaching the point where it no longer is the smooth illusion we're used to in 3D films, but it instead cleaves into two simultaneous figures.
Sort of strangely similarly, we've always liked the fifth leg on the Assyrian lamassu at the gates, gatekeepers. The leg straddles the formal and conceptual break, the literal corner, because this is a double bas-relief and it produces a partially engaged sculpture. So as a result, encoded in the object itself are multiple frontalities and multiple ways of reading it simultaneously. We see it as a work that negotiates a proto-collective, maybe with multiple viewpoints at once. And for us, this image still holds in the way that we think about our work.
So we might also be thinking about Rachel White-Read's 1993 house, the layered accretion of multiple times and lives onto a single exposed domestic object.
Right now, actually more than ever, we're thinking about Judy Chicago's dinner party and about furniture and rituals and new arrangements to produce community in real time.
We think about like that table, the tables and the still lives of Barnard, the way surfaces and objects can warp and shift our own perceptions.
We're also thinking about James Wines and the grafting of new life onto old.
And lastly, maybe Emily Flauget and the freeing of volumetric textiles to rethink bodies in space, perhaps as opposed to the work of Josef Hoffman and his wife sitting in interior here, perhaps all of us like in our homes right now. So lastly, when we talk about collectivity, it's really about seeing this and this at the same time. And for us, this is a little bit about perhaps being earnest and devious. And here, this is a self-portrait of Egon Schiele, where he sees himself twice from 1915.
So when we thought about how to frame this lecture, the only thing we could think to do is to start from where we left off a month ago, before we sort of all fell off a cliff. So a month ago, Cozy Wall, or Wall Cozy, was completed by the amazing exhibitions team at the GSD, and this was just days before everything closed. The wall operates as a shallow depth experiment, sort of half room, holding loosely recognizable everyday objects. So it holds chairs, tables, and tableware. The idea that it's somewhere between a caryatid and a tea cozy. We've created these partially engaged bodies. They produce a sort of spatial bas-relief. They're at once weird and they're viscerally familiar. They insert the domestic realm into the public space of architecture. Here, of course, the lobby of Gund Hall. We design the fabric that stretches and folds to obscure, unite, and amplify the installation's affordances. And in terms of affordances, we see those as sitting, connecting, comforting, hugging, protecting. And as simple assemblages, the objects are familiar until they turn the corner, at which point new and tactile and ergonomic territory takes hold. So we talk a lot about what are protosites for us, as a protosite for a larger scale architecture, which can negotiate collectives, corners, volume and surface. The immersive wall seating pieces and the tea tables, these are seen in plan, can be rotated and repositioned. And the idea here is to suggest ways in which objects and architectural elements can encode those multiple frontalities that we were interested in some of the earlier examples, and multiple readings of surface, depth, and even character. The rotated figures also facilitate different groupings of occupants. When turning toward one another, the wall embraces an intimate conversation. When you turn away, it provides a sort of gestural moment, and sort of perform a moment of solace. We see these pieces as prosthetic extensions of our physical presence. So they're sort of sitting there in Gund while you all can't, maybe. They're bodies whose ergonomics privilege emotional connections as much as physical efficiencies. And we often use textiles to produce these sorts of architectural effects. Jenny mentioned Emily Flauget earlier. In reevaluating the secessionist tradition, one that blurs art, architecture, fashion, and interiors, I think we're experimenting with these issues through the lens of gender, of representation, and of domesticity. And we're often favoring the radicality of Emily Flauget's dress designs. We see them as being freed from the total design environment. When they operate in the world, these dresses break from the strictures of gender roles, and also control. And they speak to the very real possible futures, something that we're all very much in the business of thinking about, particularly at this moment.
And so from where we kind of last left off, we wanted to see a little bit of how we got here, particularly in a kind of world of architectural set pieces. And we started thinking about collective inhabitation by both people and objects and all the forms that that can take. And we really kind of love objects that purposely, as we've said, deny a single understanding. And so this is our 2013 Museum of Modern Art PS1 finalist project, which argued for an equality between these sort of furry white set pieces made of white astroturf and its human inhabitants. So really seeing subjects and objects simultaneously. And our response to this brief denied the notion that the installation should be an object in the courtyard, as kind of many other winning proposals had done. Maybe that should have been our hint. And instead made the courtyard an object in itself by lining it with our installation. And embedded in this reading is that you can never get a critical distance from the installation, but you're instead immersed within it. And at the same time, it's about a confrontation with a kind of large set of tableaus. And to do this, we drew from familiar forms that disrupt on purpose scalar readings, using images of mountains, forests, caves, and kind of transforming these and abstracting them, only finding their true scale when a human figure would stand next to them. So we really see this installation as kind of both creature and environment, and it participates and mimics and stands in as a backdrop for the parties that are intended to go into the courtyard. So in the kind of follow-up of a few other images of the project, you see model shots. Oh, here's a rendering seen from above of some of these things kind of creeping out of the courtyard. The construction, and this is an early project where we're thinking about a temporal interaction. So embedded speakers and microphones within these pieces would actually whisper to you and kind of talk about the needs and the desires of the community. Go ahead one slide. Yep. And again, kind of purposely even imagining these through the model as a kind of theater set.
So if we fast forward to the last few years, our design of 26,000 square feet of permanent graphic scrim to wrap the Kendall Square garage, which is nearby in Cambridge. In this, we wrestle with the relationship between seeing surface and volume. So here that's the this and the this, and drawing and building. So this project is located in one of the, I guess you well may know it, the sort of international hotbeds of biotech, let's call it. It's situated between MIT and a rapidly changing area of what was formerly worker housing. In this project, we decided to consolidate the reading of the sprawling structure. We actually met with all of the residents that live on this Cornelius Way here at the back. This structure had annoyed them for years. And we wanted to kind of think about how to consolidate the reading, to think about what they were interested in, and to create a single icon for a changing context, while also ensuring that it not read as a monolithic object. It couldn't be as imposing as it was before. So we argue that the wrapped garage has to be presented, again, as a proto-building, read through the multiple scale articulation of its facade. You can see the scale reading changes relative to the new plaza that faces the Kendall Theater, which we'll all be happy to be able to go back to eventually, or the broad side facing the biotech R&D spaces. So this is the part of the story where, because of a sort of conservative New England urban context, we weren't able to use a lot of the color and the vibrant color that we really wish we could have in the design of this project in the final printing of it. So we reflected on the strange nature of the full-scale drawing as building. And we invented a way to make ourselves the scale figures within that drawing. So we staged the photos to act as pieces of our own imaginary version of the building. And we were sort of broken free and traversing the site. And you can see where from the inside, you read the graphics. It's almost as though you're inside of that drawing. We sort of moved across the different scales, the scale of our drawing, of our dresses, and the scale of the building, sort of have this dialogue along the different edges, and maybe upset a little bit the idea of the reading of this sort of monolith. I'm realizing there's a delay on the slides between when I hit them and when you guys see them.
All right, and so a project just under a mile from the Kendall Square Garage is our Outlier Lost project in Charlestown, which is a neighborhood of Boston. It's a building that addresses and repurposes a set of frontalities that still operate at a 2D scale. And I think if we return for a moment to the Lamassu, the winged lions that guard the temple of Nimrod, we can acknowledge that urban architecture often requires double bas-relief, right? Double kind of shallow sculpture rather than being objects in the round. And you'll understand why we argue that this building must work then as a back and a kind of front. So the project is on the former site of what was one of the most visible, invisible buildings in the neighborhood. And it's a project that's sort of around the corner from our office. So this building formerly was old Sullys Bar, and it was here for decades with no signage but high political visibility. It even starred as a location in Ben Affleck's movie, The Town. So the old building hung off of the edge of the neighborhood and with a nondescript front and an illegally expanded kitchen in its public easement. So the site's back, which you see here, actually opens to a sweeping view of all of downtown Boston and also faces the kind of approach from the Zakim Bridge, one of the icons of the city in the last 10 years. And so now you see the transformed building as it's readdressing some of these edges. Just a second. And I think you see the sort of shabby bar condition here. Anda, you're moving forward, it's just delayed.
Can you not see the drawings yet?
Nope.
I think it is on about a 3-second delay. So I'll get ahead of it.
So, yeah, 100 years ago, that back was actually originally the front of 2 row houses, which you see at the bottom here. And these row houses bore witness to a canal followed by a sea of potato sheds as a train line brought potatoes down from Maine. The structure lost its 3rd floor in a 1960s fire of one of these sheds and became its bar version of itself until 2007. And so here we were really interested in kind of collecting and conjuring the past lives of this building as a kind of act of collective preservation, which is admittedly a radical way of thinking about preservation in an otherwise very straight-laced historic town. This is a kind of major site of the American Revolution. So the pressures of these figures are not just formal, but they're ideological. Among the neighborhoods in Boston, as I've mentioning, Charlestown is really well known for its stranglehold on historic building styles, emphasizing a kind of plausible preservation over the reality of an agglomerated history.
So the result of our thinking through this is basically creating a building with a surface tension that allows us to fold the object up from 4 fairly disparate readings into one continuous but not smooth whole. And here, this underscores the orientation to multiple audiences. Even the roof has its own audience. If you are driving along 93, the elevated highway, that's really the view that you end up seeing from above. So the way we've addressed this in the interior speculates on architectural production by misusing representational tools like virtual staging. And virtual staging is a rendering technique that's popular in the real estate industry. And it's often used to sell empty homes without having to pay to stage them. And we used it instead, not to sell the home, but to conjure ghosts. The final photographs are inhabited by a cast of the structure's past and future furniture residents. We like to show these images because as we worked with the virtual stagers in Kiev, we were giving them these sort of notes as though we were writing a play and it was like stage direction. And at first they thought it was very strange, but they kind of ran with it and had a lot of fun in the kind of model. Here we go. You can see that here the bedroom becomes inhabited by characters with sort of giving a little meaning to those views and wistfulness about what might have happened there before. There's the stage direction. And so as we just go through the cast of characters here, there are bar stools left over from that infamous bar. There are characters that are, again, sort of using the window as a kind of film strip and understanding time and space and how they move past this building or this site and how the site is starting to evolve along with its context. And then I know there's a delay. Hopefully in a moment you'll be able to see this. This is the cast of characters all taking their sort of final bow or casting call.
So if we were to shift now across the city of Boston to a project of a kind of massively different scale, but has the same condition of being a kind of engaged urban site with 3 free facades. And this project is our 100,000 square foot building, 1047 Com Ave. And it's a project that we think of as a kind of small city and a commune simultaneously. And that's because this building holds 180 compact units, each of which are approximately 350 square feet. It was completed in 2016 as the first all micro or all compact building in Boston. And this project was a kind of interesting moment for us because it actually got us involved in a lot of conversations around the city of Boston and beyond about meeting housing goals, building housing types that are in demand for Boston's changing demographics, particularly of graduate students and young professionals. And the project really was another reinterpretation of an existing building, reoriented an existing 300-foot-long, 2-story concrete building, which was a garage, a car showroom. We added 4 additional floors of units, amenity spaces, commercial space, and parking. And when it was built, it was called micro-housing, though now we might think of it as co-living, which has emerged as a housing type in many cities. It was just starting in Boston prior to the pandemic. And increasingly, co-living is thought of as compact units with highly programmed shared spaces run by a larger management company. And what's important is that there's less emphasis here on personal possessions and more on experience. So more with a fascination than just a fascination with attempting to fit a full life into a small footprint, we are excited by the shared living rooms, lounges, and other spaces needed for this project. And in their role in being able to produce a domestic collective space for many inhabitants. So here you see some of the lounge and lobby spaces. So in the context of this brief, we had to load a lot of meaning into collective image making, as we did through our kind of graphic designs that we put throughout the building. And because it's a rental property, we were projecting onto a space that would anticipate a community that really didn't exist yet. So that kind of involved kind of packing as much into the limited collective space through graphics and furniture.
I think we're sort of treading a little bit into maybe scary housing types, particularly at the moment, right? The idea of sharing space, sharing life. And Jenny and I would like to argue that we sort of have to double down on that after this crisis. And then in a way we can talk through co-housing as a good model for that. So in this project, in the last project, we couldn't make the thing collectively. It was for a developer. There were no inhabitants to talk to work through the project. And I think Jenny and I very much were interested in the kind of model where we could help co-create the community along with the building. And so this is one of those projects where this works really well to work collectively. This is co-housing. Often co-housing is confused with co-living. It's a more intensive model. Jenny likes to call it a condominium commune a little bit. Everyone has their own space. And it's often created by and for its intended inhabitants. And it's lived in for decades. Sometimes it's lived in for lifetimes. And this is our current project here. This is in Malden, Mass, and is one of those housing communities, co-housing communities. We mentioned earlier Rachel White-Reed, her work House in 1993, which is essentially an interior cast of a typical East End row house. It was slated for demolition, and she cast it from the interior and removed the building to expose the sort of intimate interior spaces that are sort of frozen in time through the markings that are left. The layers and the evidence of its inhabitation are really important to us here. I'm really interested. And holding together these now exposed individual interiors into an impression of a larger whole, it starts to expose almost uncomfortably the domestic parts and the social relationships that are otherwise encased in that single house. We like this reference as a way to think through time, through trace, and cast in sort of relationships. So finally, for the co-housing project, we draw on a similar tension in the simultaneous reading of the part to the whole. So these are a series of studies when we started working on the project. I think it's made more complex by a set of existing and projected social relationships for that co-housing community that will occupy each domestic part, the units, and the common spaces. So from the start, our position was that this building must act as a single house and simultaneously act as a collective set of 30 houses for approximately 100 inhabitants. So here, again, the seeming smoothness of the front of the building is made complicated by the back, revealing the complexity of the new domestic parts. There are multiple levels of shared public and private space, and they're all distributed among the individual units.
And really formally, even within this kind of fragmentation on the interior, the building had to read as a single object. And this is in kind of stark opposition to the scattering, which is the typical format for the approximately 150 co-housing communities in the US, which are usually suburban or rural. And this is a kind of image, not of our project, but of one of these typical setups where a set of single family houses are scattered around a collective common house, which then holds shared dining, cooking, and living spaces. But for us, we had 3/4 of an acre in Greater Boston, and this format was clearly not going to work. And so the clients needed their 30 units, 5,000 square feet of common house, ample outdoor space, and working gardens. And so what we've done is that consolidate these spaces into an interwoven set of relationships between the common space, individual apartments, outdoor decks and gardens, while also trying to find moments for kind of domestic intimacy at different scales. So here we might see a kind of large scale but cozy public space. And basically this is one of the models that we use as a kind of explanatory tool for our clients as well as a design tool. And kind of moving through some of these images, just as ways to imagine a kid's space or kind of the scale of one of these windows, always in tension, or the dining room with a domestic scale that they're familiar with.
The delay is getting us. Can you see it?
Yep. And so you can imagine that getting approximately 60 or 70 owner occupants in a room to agree on a design is a huge undertaking. And so what we had to do was invent over the past few years a set of participatory design models that put at the center of the process the agency of the user. So this was about really trusting that users have a capacity, or really for future residents, right, to make major decisions about the design of their own environment. But they've likely not been given the vocabulary to name their likes and dislikes in architectural terms.
So we sort of had to invent a process here, and our process collectively builds that vocabulary up. We started from the individual room unit and in one workshop and building up the aggregation, and then all the way out to the sort of larger scale social issues across the site. And it's allowed our clients to feel that they have made some discoveries, and then also to definitely trust that when we're making design decisions, that those decisions will serve them well. And that we've spent so much time with them in this process that we now understand what their desires are and what they're interested in. Decision-making for this group balances the many viewpoints with a consensus governing model. So you can imagine we were very excited to get to work with a group that had to work through consensus. Consensus means that if one person in the group puts a hold and says they don't want to move forward, then the group has to work towards making sure that that person is comfortable before they can move forward. So it's not voting, it's not majority rules, it is this kind of intensive process, which has worked really well. When we had to move that process online, these jam boards were really important as a way to kind of get the group to see, sorry, in a minute you'll see this, get the group to kind of reconnect together, but now not in the same space. There's my 4-year-old jumping into that big workshop that we had just 2 weeks ago.
So at a much smaller scale, we might think, again, about a collective constructed around a spatial object, perhaps not a building. And here we like to reference Judy Chicago's feminist masterpiece, The Dinner Party from 1979. And just sort of anecdotally, Chicago said that she was inspired for this by attending a real dinner party in 1974. And she says, quote, "The men at the table were all professors. And the women all had doctorates but weren't professors. The women had all the talent and they were sitting silent while the men held forth. I started to think that women have never had a Last Supper, but they have had dinner parties." Right? And this is seen here in parallel on the right with a dinner for people working on the installation. And so in our practice, we have challenged ourselves to ask, can we make objects like the one on the left that push intellectual and formal boundaries while also constructing a real community in real time, like on the right? And so kind of one answer to this for us is our project that we called Place Setting. And we thought about it as kind of not a symposium, not a board meeting, and not a private party. And instead, kind of a warm but weird environment designed to host intimate dinner parties that are also open and transparent in a civic space. So here you have a table and a performance, basically a kind of proscenium stage made from a shipping container. Each meal would experiment with different arrangements of tables and chairs seen in plan. And so basically we studied that when the party could breach this installation box, or table legs would grow and shrink, kind of like mountain goats, or loosely implied perimeters would allow passersby to be inches from dinner guests, we could watch these conversations get more or less formal, break up, or kind of touch on revolution.
Little background here, Place Setting is an ongoing self-motivated and self-funded project for our office. We created it along with our partner, Gabriel Mugar, who's a senior design researcher at IDEO, also my husband. The first iteration of Place Setting, I said that very quickly, Place Setting took over 4 days on Boston City Hall Plaza during Hub Week. I like when Jenny describes these paintings.
So, and thinking about a dinner as a performance, right? We were thinking about images of Da Vinci's Last Supper, which you'll see on the screen in just a second.
Oh, wow, it's that long, sorry.
As well as Rembrandt's etching after Da Vinci just to the right of it. And these arrangements, of course, conflict with what we know a Roman table would have looked like in a triclinium, a kind of U-shaped dining surface surrounded by reclining couches in the lower left. And so this kind of strange problem of frontality and then seeing one another is perhaps best captured in this more plastic form in the Flemish Baroque painter Jean-Baptiste de Champagne's 1630 image of the Last Supper, which sort of takes the linear table and starts to fold it in space towards us.
And for us, what emerges in these paintings is that it's hard to understand the meal as an object or an environment. And it's something that we wanted to explore, the kind of gray zone between those things. Our installation, as we said, housed those 4 public meals. The guests were from a mix of grassroots and legacy institutions. And the themes for each of the dinners revolved around the growing disparity in income in Greater Boston. So we brought together a series of experts who often don't talk to each other in informal settings or are working in parallel but haven't spoken to each other. The meals were loosely structured around a menu of conversations. Can you see those up right now? Jenny, yes, okay.
Yes.
And and when you're sitting on City Hall Plaza, the backdrop was created by these angled mirrors. And a lot of the work encouraged sort of sanctioned eavesdropping so that you were both having an intimate dinner, but people could come close, and there was a sort of level of expertise that was being being developed and also then being listened to. And as an extension of the table into other dimensions, we used the materials and the mirroring to sort of multiply and confuse a little bit who was at the table, who was outside of the table. Then between the meals, the visitors could sit and listen or read the notes that were left over on the table. These were all plates that were underneath the real plates with notes and provocations that stayed on the table for each of the rounds of the dinner. The last piece of this I think that we find exciting is the idea that you could produce a kind of post-occupancy report of an event that would then help to redesign new events. So the audio of the conversation is accessible, and they underscore, you can sort of hear the difference in the types of conversation happening based on the different arrangement of tables. So you can understand the difference in social engagement. These cartoon quotes are from the dinner at the top, and then the follow-up interview quotes act as that post-occupancy report that we're interested in, and one reason that it was really important to work with the social scientists on this project.
Yeah, and we've continued this set of experiments and we'll continue to do it in the future as well. And one of these workshops was with the Masters of Design Engineering students at Harvard as a kind of quick exercise using a kind of Mad Libs format for the menus and having them actually design small dinner seating areas within a classroom for each other, just as a quick experiment.
So you can see we keep coming back to the table. We've continued to explore its power and the way that configurations of tables and sort of transient and atemporal participation can have a profound effect on the sort of creation of collectivity. We're employing the same techniques of multiple frontalities and vantage points for the table surface itself. And of course, at this moment, we're particularly focused on the remote and the atemporal aspects of the work. And we're combining images like this one, which is a 14th century fresco in Rimini, with this one, and it's hard to deliver a punch joke quickly on Zoom with the delay. In a minute, you'll see the Zoom version of The Last Supper. Is it up there?
Yep.
Jenny? Okay, good.
Yes.
Tough to get that, you know, like, So here we're proposing that the table is a collective space for sharing in both real time and remotely. I think Jenny and I, if we are home for the next few months, we'll actually create these in our two houses as a kind of experiment in how to work together. As the table folds up the wall to create a projection surface, we can interact with the projection of after images of people who have seated before us. And we want to start to use the active horizontal table surface as a place to project what's happening in real time on both of our tables.
And so if we think about the things that we might find on a table, we're also working on objects that one shares as a vehicle to study both the effects of slight strangeness, the kind of term that Marcus brought up that we kind of keep using, and it's intended to disarm its users. It's also a proto-site for kind of this continued work on the relationship between the urban corner as a series of bas-reliefs, as well as the cast. And here we have just images of a kind of distorted set of tea objects that we've made in our office, between a mug, a teapot, and in some places like that winged lion, right, you see that through the conflation of these shallow elevation views, actually we get a third handle or a second and a third handle on a teapot, suggesting multiple users for pouring. Or a kind of new way to interface with a mug. And these, of course, come from some of the techniques that are in still lifes of Barnard, of Cézanne, where the kind of folding of perspectival space, the conflation of different angles of vision start to warp or kind of produce a kind of uncanny separation between field and object for us.
So we only have one project left. So from the table to the object to now the giant table. We want to share this last project that we worked on last summer. We were asked to submit a design proposal for Coachella 2020. I think Jenny, you said Coachella now is what it's being called.
It's now Coachella.
Did I just say, yeah, Coachella? It's good. This would have been our 40-foot tall pillow fort, which we're making a lot of at my house right now. So when faced with the prompt to create a recognizable but strange image as a pavilion, we were drawn immediately to questions of scale and to perceptions of childhood. So here, well-known image on the left, lesser-known image on the right, thinking about how a child's conception of the sort of continuous space.
Just came.
We're working again in this
Continuous
project.
monument.
Yes.
Sorry.
Oh, do we have to reference that? I felt everybody would know it.
Yeah. Yeah.
See, it's harder when Jenny and I aren't in the same place. It's a little harder to riff, but so in this image, of course, we're working again with the familiar, from American kitsch to Breuer's Seska chairs, which we'll see in a minute, which were part of our own childhood. We ended up proposing a set of lounging surfaces below, which you see in these sort of elevational shots of the model. And then a kind of colors. One is fallen over, one is sitting up, and the sort of table and the assemblages below. The blanket works to blur and create a larger amorphous body as roof. But when you're underneath this structure, the idea is that you're traversing below these sort of chair legs and it's feeling like an arcade space. Is that arcade space up?
Not quite yet.
Okay.
I think we're still on the side by side. Yep.
Oh, we're in a strange way. Okay.
Yeah, the image on the screen now is of that canopy structure, right? Actually seeing these as a kind of body of roofs that come together.
Tell me when you can see it. I'll just keep going forward.
Yeah, and here we see the kind of close-up of what this kind of architectural language of being between chair legs or picnic table legs might look like. Yep, you can stop here. And now we have the kind of drawing of some of these assemblies more at the object scale as we were studying them. And so I think, as Anda mentioned, it's really only at a distance that these discrete objects can be understood. And the architecture of the table as a spatial vehicle for connection is constantly being returned to in our work. And so this last image that we're going to put on the screen before we kind of wrap up is actually a project that we're calling Dinner Cozy. And since we started the talk where we left off a month ago, this is where when we're allowed to be together. And this is an early, we know will happen. And it's a table that actually gives you a hug, which we could all probably use right now. And so with that, I think we will look to the questions.
All right. Jenny, I'm going to have you take it away because I am, my internet is not so great at the moment. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yep, I can hear you.
Pull up the Q&A.
There we go. Okay. So we have a question that's about knowing that co-housing communities are intentional groups at the beginning and programs are developing and designing depend on the starter group that is what is the flexibility of the spaces if desires and needs change at the time an architect is engaged. And so as an architect, where do you put your professional career while you have too many clients and needs in the same time? Okay, so it's kind of a two-part question, thinking about the flexibility and change over time. And I think in co-housing, understanding that a kind of mix of unit types and that actually people are moving in and out of different units. They might start in a studio and end up in a 4-bedroom is quite common. And that hopefully the intent is that over lifespans, I think we've heard anecdotes of families forming, dismantling, reforming, and friends kind of joining. So that's one of the advantages. So,
Should I take the next one? Are we okay?
Yeah, you take the next one.
As long as you guys can hear me, let me know. So this question is, social isolation is one of the key problems to solve with co-housing. After these pandemic times, do you think communal spaces will change or any of them disappear? Jenny and I have been having this anecdotal conversation lately, and we quite frankly felt a little bit that we were a little worried when we had this large workshop. It was the last workshop for our group before now ground has been broken for the co-housing. And the first thing that we did was just sort of had this large conversation of like, if you were in co-housing now, what would you be doing? Would you want to be there? And there was this resounding yes, that everyone wished that they could have, the project could have been built. And that even if they had to be Zooming from their 2 units next to each other, they'd be leaving pies in front of each other's doors and leaving messages and finding ways to make sure that their community was still strong. And I mean, it's interesting, my own street has had that kind of feeling. I didn't know any of my neighbors before. Now we've got a Google group and everybody talks to each other. So I do think that communal spaces, collective building of spaces will be a hot topic because of resiliency and the building of communities that support one another. I do think there's this interesting spatial question though of co-housing being a really great model because everyone still has their own private space. If you have something like a pandemic, you can shelter in place, but the spaces themselves then are unused until that point that you can come back together. Anybody?
Yeah, I think that is the strange paradox, and we've been, thinking a little bit about even the history after the bubonic plague in Europe, and actually the kind of move to urbanize and feudal farmers leaving their kind of rural home to actually collectivize and change society to something more of what we know it to be today. So we're sort of optimistic that density in cities will not be on the decline or unpopular. And we have a question here about basically how do we establish the fluidity between architecture and installation work in our firm? And I think this is a really kind of crucial question for us, that it's actually about the time scale of just how long it takes a building to be complete, right? From design to final photographs can take years, if sometimes not decades. And some of our first projects really had many lives and took almost 7 years to get finished. So in the meantime, the kind of quicker and more engaged way of working, and particularly starting installation work that was self-initiated, right? So not necessarily, or not really ever through an uninvited competition or through, kind of funding from an outside source first. It was typically something we'd have an idea for, we'd test, and we'd kind of try to find a home for. And so I think the kind of the balance of that is something we really try to maintain, because the kind of time scale of getting our ideas out is really benefited from doing this work at smaller scale and more quickly.
All right, I'm gonna go, there's 2 long questions next. I'll take the first one, you take the next one, and then we'll keep an eye on time. Okay, it's 12:59, we're pretty good. Okay, so this question is, I've noticed that a few projects, particularly place setting and the table, focus on a sort of performativity in the mundane aspects of life. Do you see performativity as work in concert with distortion of perception to shuffle conventions of interaction with objects and architecture? It's an interesting question. I think we often talk about in place setting the idea that the first iteration was on City Hall Plaza and that people didn't know if they were supposed to be performing or not. And I know that there are ways, in fact, we wanted to do that on purpose. And in fact, we had to kind of hold strong to that when people would ask, when they were the sort of guinea pigs for this first experiment, like, what is it? What should I be doing? And we'd say, we actually just want you to be in the moment and to think as if you were in a private room, but also know that people could be listening. And that as a sort of state of being was really fascinating to see people have to kind of work through. It was incredibly successful because at the end of the day, it brought sort of people's best selves to the table. They were both It's as though like you had someone's best day on Twitter where they decided to be as vulnerable as possible, but also as kind and generous and open. And I think that just sense of having other bodies and other people around is important. The objects and the architecture and the way that they started to interact in the early place setting on City Hall Plaza was important to us, and it was more subtle. I think that it was about creating just enough of a strange place. You were already on City Hall Plaza. You were sort of encompassed by on one side, sort of hugged and not on the other. And that started us thinking about how maybe the objects on the table could create more physical vulnerability and proximity and more ways that people have to be forced to share, not just what they're talking about, but to physically share across the table. That could have a kind of interaction. That's where a lot of the pieces of sort of performing the tea ceremony of the teapot with 3 handles and having to, again, not have a script for that, but figure out how to do it is one of the ways in which we've been interested in taking away the conventions of normal, as you're saying, the sort of normative interaction, but not making people uncomfortable, instead making them just a little bit curious and trying to understand where they are and what they're doing.
And so there's a question that's about knowing or not knowing the future occupants of the buildings you design, and the kind of difference between working so closely with our co-housing clients and then working on buildings that are for developers that are essentially spec buildings at times. And I think this actually gets to maybe that question of performativity and actually about the agency of objects. And so our intent, our hope is that embedded in what we design are small cues that future occupants will read. But this is something that we actually are fascinated in thinking about working on. And the kind of post-occupancy study is for housing, and particularly developer housing, something that we don't get to engage in as much. However, the kind of rendering technique of virtually staging our Outlier Lofts project is kind of getting at exactly this, is that we wouldn't know the future inhabitants of this project, nor did we want to kind of tie the particularities of their life and their possessions to the space. And so instead we see it as a kind of open stage for many different lives to play out, and that we like the idea that we could actually re-inhabit those photographs in the future with a new set of references or ideas.
All right, I'm gonna go, this is a quick one and it's a speculation one, so maybe we answer it together. Do you think this remote work period due to COVID-19 will make architects rethink space and design within homes and flats? Will we concept differently? I think will we think of it conceptually differently? Yeah, I think this is like the $1 million question that everyone is trying to answer, right? For us, in terms of collective working, I think we have had to figure out how to run our small office, and that in and of itself has been hard. I can't imagine a 500-person firm right now and how that sort of interaction is happening. But I do think that this is, if ever you need to have a trial by fire to figure out what remote working looks like, throwing people into it rather than speculating is probably the best way to figure that out. I think that's a sort of a larger answer.
And I would say, I'd say the work part is probably not at risk, but it's all of the human connections that we lose when we are just interfacing with our laptop screens. And so part of our inspiration for the kind of table that folds up the wall is more relevant than ever as I think about transitioning from my day of work Zooming to socializing Zooming, and the kind of inadequacy of the format. And just thinking about how more immersive video projection, even the question of the scale of your friend or family member's body in your own house as an image could start to kind of bridge this disconnect between all of the kind of the cues that we pick up just by being proximate.
So in terms of time, we have quite a few questions. Should we do the sort of like start from the last, or do we keep going? I'm gonna play question roulette. How do you want to do it, Jen?
I think we we should just do a kind of, one or two more, and try to use that as a kind of way to cover more ground. And I think maybe the very last one, was there a project or idea that was too strange to people that they would actually participate? And I think this is always our fear, is the kind of question of, you can make something, of course, but there's no way to know whether or not anyone will be interested in it. And so kind of calibrating all of the sort of social cues, and in particular, the last image we showed of the tablecloth that actually has these appendages that are wearable, gets down to the metrics of what is uncomfortable, right? And so actually mocking some of those things up, thinking about explaining to someone a kind of almost performance art piece without having to make too many jokes or derisive comments about what it is that you're trying to do, is the sort of balance. I think maybe the question of a kind of text messaging project, Anna could speak to a little bit.
Oh, sort of project that was too early for its time.
Yeah.
10 years ago, I created this fictional story with a writer in Syracuse, New York, that was dispersed throughout the city through text message. And I think there was something about that it was at a moment, well, it's longer than 10 years ago, 12 years ago. It was at a moment when we were thinking about atemporality in sort of academic project and the intellectual project. And it required a lot to get buy-in from the community to jump into something that did seem strange and seemed superfluous in a way. And I think that the more that Jenny and I have developed over the last 10 years, how to make something not too strange, to have buy-in by first making something familiar and then working through that kind of project, has allowed us to actually have less things that people look at us like we're crazy when we do, and more things that actually can start some real conversations through the work.
I think I will close with this last and very endearing question for the both of us, which is, how do we always look happy while we're designing? And it's difficult to find pleasure, and I cannot imagine when something won't be built, how I can be happy. And can we take that away?
So the question is, how do we, or just how does everyone?
I mean, I'm assuming it's we, but how does one remain a kind of sunny outlook on design?
Well, I think that, Jenny, you and I are probably a great example of, because we've found each other, and we just happen to be sisters, that helps, but because we found each other and we found that working together in and of itself was enjoyable, I think that has created a sort of a space, if you will, for the kind of happiness that comes with just being able to collaborate and to think and to connect with another person through that work. I do think that happiness we always have the conversation of whether it's based on outward success or inward satisfaction. And I do think that finding yourself someone to work with that you are actually just happy if that other person likes what you're doing, and you don't have to externalize it, means that work can thrive and then can be externalized to the world, but that you always feel happy about that thing that you're doing.
I think that's it. I think that's the kind of joy of the studio environment, and getting excited about problems together, realizing that you don't have to have the right answer, but actually the kind of the privilege of just speculating about it is the pleasure. So I think that is it's a nice place to end. And I do agree that with our message of collectivity, that really being able to engage in conversation and try to get to why you're interested in things that you're designing with other people is critical. You can't just be in a vacuum. So I think we might leave it there. Again, thank you so much for joining us virtually. And it's really a pleasure to be able to share some work, and we hope to see you all in person in not too long away from now.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.